All right, so welcome everyone. This is going to be our opening. This is going to be another podcast of our Pathway series where we talk to individuals who are in a STEM or science field and kind of talk about how they got into that field and their journey through the educational system, through college, and how they end up where they're at now. I have a friend of a family, or I guess you're technically related to me, so
Yes,
I'm
so.
just gonna put that out there. Yeah, through the vines. I won't explain because it will go into whatever. But I'll let you introduce yourself, and I'll just let you take it away.
All right, cool. Thanks. So my name is Jessica Sarver. I am an assistant professor of chemistry at Slippery Rock University in Western Pennsylvania. Um, Grew up in Western PA. I went to undergrad at Penn State Barron in Erie, got my degree there, which we'll talk about, I think, at some point with some of the questions you might have. And then I went to grad school at the University of Pittsburgh to get my PhD in chemistry. And yeah, so my pathway keeps going. Is then I went and did a postdoctoral research um, stint at the University of Virginia, did an assistant professorship at Swarthmore College, which is a small liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia. And then I started a tenure track position at Western PA at a prior institution before landing at Slippery Rock. So,
Mm. Can I just tell you? I don't know if I've ever told you this story. I think it was like the first time we met. It was either at my brother's wedding or sometime around that time. We were talking, and it was like my first year of teaching. And when we found out that we were both science people, you started explaining some of your research, and I felt like that Good Burger video where it was like,
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Mm. 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 I know some of these words.
every like fourth word I got, it was like, ooh, electron, I know that one. Spin, I know that word. It was just like you were explaining, and I was trying to follow along, and I still go back to that memory because I was like, I think I just realized how much I didn't understand of science still. So it was a humbling, but it was also a very fond memory from our
yeah,
first interaction.
that's funny. I love it.
All right, so let's just dive into the your pathway into your career right now. In high school, did you always know you wanted to go into a STEM field? Did you always know that you wanted to go into the science field, or did you really like your science classes? Tell me about what your kind of outlook in life was in high school.
Okay, so I would even say prior to high school, I reflecting back, right, later on in college and grad school, would have been able to predict that I was going to go into a STEM field. I was always interested in and did well in math. And I think I liked the sciences, although I don't really recall like feeling super inspired about them up until high school. And in high school, I took a lot more science classes than I leaned into other things. But I did well in math and I was interested in science. I always joke that I've always loved nature and I liked animals and I liked dissecting animals. So I always joke that I think my parents might have been afraid I was going to be a serial killer or a chemistry professor. Turns out I chose the better of the two. Um, but I do recall like doing little weird, you know what I mean? Like playing with animals and if they got crushed or something happened, or maybe I might have poked at them a little too much, like kind of looking at the insides. And I grew up in a hunting family. And so when we would get something, kill something, I was interested in all the insides and all of those things. And so reflecting back, it's like, yeah, no, it was definitely more science oriented. And then, yeah, in high school, I took I can't remember all of the potential higher up courses that I took, but like I know I took AP Bio and AP Chemistry, and it was like, yeah, that's a given. They're offered. Yes, I'm definitely taking those. And that
Hmm.
interest was there. And then I would say also, I don't want to like jump the gun, but like getting into thinking about going to college and what I would like major in at that point. I grew up, I'm a child of the late 80s and lived through the 90s as a kid and or young adolescent, I guess. And so the X-Files were very popular and I wanted to be Dana Scully and be a forensic pathologist. So for those of you who don't know what the X-Files are, you're gonna have to Google it, but um, that was, forensics is where I thought, that TV kind of helped inspire that kind of orientation in the sciences and kind of led me down the path of chemistry, choosing chemistry as a degree.
That is amazing because when I was a kid, I was also into the X Files, and I just saw it last night. I was on Hulu, and I was like, it came up. I'm like, oh, I should just rewatch them again. I watched them a couple years ago, but I'm
Love
just
it.
gonna rewatch a couple of the great episodes. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Odd question. It's not one of the questions that we talked about beforehand. Was your family? Were there a lot of your family members that were into the, I want to say sciences, but were they in academia at all, or were you kind of one of the first that kind of jumped that bridge and got into academia?
So it's actually really interesting and cool. So my folks, no. My parents, relatively, I would say blue collar, right, in terms of their occupation and kind of more so even like kind of like interest, never really in the sciences much. But interestingly enough, on my mother's side, my grandfather majored in chemistry and got a degree in chemistry before he decided to go to seminary. So he was a reverend minister. And then his I want to say like a brother or an uncle, like in his side of the family, also worked for, I want to say maybe worked for Chevron, but he didn't have a degree at that time. And
Hmm.
so probably was like a chemist, but wasn't necessarily properly educated. And I also have a cousin on that side has a degree in chemistry. So yeah, we kind of like fluttered through in and out within that. But
So
and
yeah, so
nobody,
just a
it's
little bit
not
interesting.
just a little bit. And then I would say that's my mom's side. And then on my dad's side, I do have several relatives that are in academia, but
Hmm.
not in the sciences and not necessarily like higher ed, more administrative or special education, things like that. So yeah, a little bit of both. Kind of a nice merging between the two sides of the family.
I always find it interesting. I've been talking to more people and talking about their obviously they've went to college in some capacity. They
Mhm.
speak about how either they were very privy to it because they had both parents that did go
Yeah.
through the educational system, or they didn't have any of that and they kind of had to figure it out with themselves. So I think it would be it's a positive thing for students that are watching this video kind of hear both sides of, hey, there's two different paths that people take and both are successful. It's just how they go through it.
Yeah.
So we already talked about why you chose to go into the science field, but why? What was your major in college, and what was that experience like of going from high school into college? And just talk a little bit more about that transition.
Yeah. So, all right. So Dana Scully, X-Files, I was thinking forensic pathology. I did observe an autopsy in high school, and it was a little scary. It was a little weird, right? Mostly being in like being in the funeral home back quarters where they were doing the autopsies, dead body around the corner, dead body over there, dead body here. Like that was a bit much. The autopsy was pretty cool to get to see the human body, but it was very evident to me after that I was like, this is not a daily thing. This is not. I have no interest in doing this on the regular. It felt a little too dark for me, and also I don't think I'm that like into like human anatomy. It was just kind of like it was a sciencey thing, and I thought it looked cool on TV, but it turns out for a job, I just didn't see myself going down that path. So I kind of was like, all right, forensics, something, but that forensics could be crime scene investigator, toxicologist, or lab scientist, or what have you. And so when I started kind of picking schools that I was looking um, to attend, I was meeting with I want to say just primarily chemistry faculty, and I think I visited basically two schools, and both of them didn't have any forensic science programs, but they were like, but if that's what you want to pursue, you just get a degree in chemistry, you can do that afterwards. And so that was pretty obvious, that was going to be my path, and I was like, yeah, I'm fine with that. I don't remember thinking much about it beyond that, just thinking like, okay, and if I like the place, you know what I mean, that's obviously really important. And Chris, just to kind of go back to like your prior statement about kind of family history is like, I said like kind of the chemistry kind of fluttered in and out, and the same with kind of like academic experience or higher ed experience is that my grandfather went to college, my folks did not, right? Then I went to college, so I was kind of a first generation student, even though I had, people above me that had gone on before. And so I think, when my parents and I were kind of vetting where I was going to go to school, I don't think they had any, because they hadn't done that process, before.
Mm.
And so that was, we kind of didn't know what we were looking for. But, I didn't give much thought. It was just kind of like, I like chemistry. And if chemistry can get me into forensics, then that's what we shall do. And as long as I like the campus, we're going to do that, and so then kind of majored in chemistry, from there on out, and just kind of, you'll see there's a running theme in all of my answers, which is I didn't give it a whole lot of thought and I kind of did it and it worked out. And I can reflect on that maybe kind of towards the end. I think I'd save that for, but it probably was kind of built up in me. And so I had like a pretty secure vision that that was going to work out, but I didn't think pathways down beyond that. I was just like, okay, yeah, that's what people were suggesting. That seems to work for me.
One thing I've been learning with this is, as my podcaster has been responding, there's like 8 things that I'm like, oh my gosh, I love that, and I want to like point them all out, but then I forget all of them. One of the things I
like, get out,
I need to start writing these things down.
Start writing them. Take them to the screen.
One of the things I think is really good for kids to hear is sometimes you can overthink things, and like you said, you pretty much had a passion for something. You talked to a couple of people and you just went with it. And I think sometimes students can get wrapped up in these decisions where, yes, they are major decisions, but you'll find your way. Like, even if you make a bad decision, you'll find your way. So as you were in college and as you were kind of, figuring out more about science, more about chemistry, and I just remembered what I was going to say. I always recommend students, when they're looking at college, again, they think that they kind of have to have everything planned out, and they have to like, oh, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And I tell them, have a general idea. Like you said, go for chemistry, and then find the more specifics. And I think it's just human nature. We want to have a plan, but I think it's also great for students to hear like, hey, just go to college and try to figure it out, and then have a better plan after that. But as you were trying to figure it out, were there any like classes, professors, or experiences that really kind of shaped your direction, or maybe even made you pivot a little bit?
Yeah, I think that there were 2 major pivots actually that happened in my college career. So go in and I'm majoring in chemistry, did really well my first year. I did, I was getting good grades. I was able to, succeed in the classes. I think it was a good, it was a good choice. I was happy with my degree. But then, I also, one of the things I didn't mention that helped me with my decision of going to school, again, I think kind of reflecting back on like, because we weren't quite sure what we were doing when we were looking for schools, was I was an athlete. And so I remember talking a lot with my folks about, well, where are you going to go and run? And a lot less on, and this is not a reflection on my parents. I'm not trying to diss them, but it comes down to sometimes not knowing how to make that decision, and how you reflect back on, you go, oh man, but it's okay. Like sometimes you have to find those things that will help you filter out other decisions. And I'm definitely a person that gets like decision paralysis. Like if I have way too many options, it's like, no, take them away. I need 2. And I can work with that. And so that's what we did. I boiled it down to 2 schools that I would run at, and went and visited both chemistry programs. So chemistry was fine, and that was the decision. But, both of these decisions actually happened kind of later in my career, which was to, 1, quit running. And so I decided to do that going into my senior year, which was really hard because I had the same coach all 4 years, and he was going to be coaching my senior year. I had made most of my friend groups, a lot of them, through my athletics and running, and it kind of identified as that, but it had kind of just lost its appeal to me, and kind of like that strict focus for me. And for some students that is not the case, but for me, I was starting to see more of like, okay, I'm a chemist, right? And so like I was starting to make that transition into that, and that's where I wanted to lean into a little bit more. And I also was able to then maybe do other activities on campus that I hadn't been able to do. I had a service fraternity I was in that I leaned into, and I really enjoyed my senior year. And so that was a really hard decision. Part of me maybe regrets it a little, because you just kind of like missed out on that last senior year with everybody. But ultimately, I think the other opportunities I was able to take advantage of in my senior year, I don't regret, and so that was something. And then I think sometime around like junior year, and I don't remember the thought process behind this, but, one could say, like, if you measure in sciences, how do you know physics, chemistry, biology? Like, they kind of all meld together when you're a bit younger. I knew physics wasn't going to be it. Never loved physics, and I'm a physical chemist, which is kind of physics and chemistry. But if it doesn't have molecules, I just don't get it. But biology, I decided my junior year, I think it was, to get a minor in biology. I think I just sat down and realized, like, I think I would like taking some of these classes, and I think that I could squeeze it in. And so I don't recall if Penn State had like a biochem degree, but I ended up getting a bachelor's of science in chemistry with a minor in biology, so effectively like a biochem degree. But I decided that like pretty late on, like it wasn't anything. I didn't go in with that intention. It just, was like I've got these, the availability to take these classes, fill my credits, why not? And, it was nice because I took some really great biology courses that I loved. I remember taking a biochem and a protein structure and function course that I thought was super cool, that I loved. Yeah. And I hadn't actually, as you said, as we talked before this started, like reflecting on things that kind of pop into your head, like that was probably a really formative class because I ended up and still do work on proteins. And so I learned kind of just like the very basics that I didn't have a real good understanding of before then. I also learned that I was glad I wasn't a bio major.
Why do you say that?
I would say taking the intro bio courses, if I may politely say this, like it wasn't lighting me up, right? It was like, there's the content. I understand said content. Moving on. I remember doing a lab too where I had to like measure the height of plants, and I was like, please just make it stop. But I did get to do a dissection as well, and that was cool. Back to my serial killer ways. I was very happy doing the dissection.
That is awesome. So, sorry, keep on going.
No, I was just going to say, I think the formative courses were probably those upper level ones, where I was really got to get involved in the very niche kind of aspects and kind of really formulate like who I later became as a career chemist.
I forgot that we've talked about us both doing track and running in college.
Yeah.
And just to go back to what you're saying about making your decision for senior year, my wife also, I think we've all talked about this. My wife also ran. I can't remember if she ran her senior year or not, but I know I had that decision to make because for me, I personally wasn't doing well, just performance wise. And I had to make the decision during my senior year whether I wanted to keep it going. And I did decide to keep it going, but I also kind of look back, like you say, you kind of regret that you didn't keep going. I kind of regret that I did keep going a little bit. I mean, I enjoyed my year, but I look back at, the sacrifices that I had to make. And I think a lot of students don't, maybe realize that is a huge commitment that you have to, really dive into. And it sometimes shapes your course load because if you're in season, maybe you can't take those extra classes like you're talking about. And I remember, sorry, I'm going to give a little story. I remember I had a chance to go to Penn Relays, and I actually was taking a biochemistry class that I was not doing well in. And instead of going to Penn Relays, I chose to take the final because if I didn't take the final, I'd have to take an alternate final like a couple days before, and I needed that time. And I remember my coaches being like, "Wait, you mean to tell me you're gonna not go to Penn Relays and take this final?" And I was like, "Guys, I have 2 more weeks to be track athlete. I have the rest of my life to be a biochemistry a biologist. Like, one of these is going to affect my life greater than the other, and that's going." And now, again, looking back, I kind of wish I would have went to Penn Relays, but it's a decision I made, and I'll stick with it. So I totally understand what you're saying with the amount of sacrifice that you have to give to do an athletic and be a science major in college.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it has its positives. Definitely early on, it helped with my structure, and it was like an immediate, I had a group, you know what I mean? And I had peers that were like above me that I could talk to that were other science majors and kind of say like, okay, learn from them and see how you're doing it. But, I think that actually us having the 2 different experiences and both regretting a little bit on each, that's life, right? That's always making a decision and trying to figure out, like, weighing it out. But I think also, and this was going to be, and I'll say it now because then I can just say it throughout the whole thing, is like my take home message is pretty much like you make a decision and then it is up to you to kind of find your happiness with that decision.
Yes.
Some things get decided for you and you could be PO'd about that, or, how long you're going to be mad about that will happen. But like, I think ultimately you've got to work within yourself and what you have given that it's not something extremely dire, right? To kind of find your happiness there. So once I got my degree in chemistry, I did go to grad school. I think I mentioned that at the beginning at University of Pittsburgh. And so that's what I was trying to think of. Like, there were many people that have shaped me. I mean, I know I had an awesome high school chemistry teacher that I loved that was just fun and made lab fun. And then there were those courses that I think shaped what I liked in college. But then when I got to grad school at Pitt at the time, I don't know if they still do it now, but when you were in the PhD program and going into chemistry, there's like 5 major branches of chemistry, right? There's analytical chemistry, organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, physical chemistry, and biochemistry, generally speaking, and some things are kind of in between those. And so at Pitt, you had to kind of decide like what was your branch that you were majoring in, and you had to take so many classes that were in that branch. So I was like, okay, kind of staying with that forensics theme, I think I like analytical, which would be you have something you're trying to analyze and you want to know how well can you detect it, or you want to know how much of it is there, you want to quantify, you want to kind of like rip it apart and see what it's made up of or whatever. And I thought that's where it was. And one of the courses I took my first semester in graduate school was a spectroscopy course. So spectroscopy, for those that aren't super familiar with it, is just a technique that uses light to interact with matter that can tell you something about matter. It depends what it is the question you're asking and what source of light you use, but that's generally what it is. And so I thought, analytical chemistry is what I wanted. I take this course. It was phenomenal. And it was definitely life-changing. And interestingly enough, the fellow who taught it, my professor, ended up being my PhD advisor going forward. But it taught me, it had like just the right math element, just the right like practical element of how the phenomena of spectroscopy worked, and then also the element of like how it was actually utilized to investigate. And that has like stuck with me throughout my career, because it's something that like if I could take that class again, I would. Like, I loved it. And I think that's where I got to sit back and reflect and be like, oh, I get to be like my kind of chemist now. I'm not analytical, but like this is the thing that I like. And that helps kind of make a lot of decisions, I think, through graduate school, the group I decided to join, and then, what I've decided to pursue both in my research and, things that I can kind of choose to do in my teaching.
Did you expect to like it that much before you went into it?
I think I would, because I was like, ooh, I've always liked spectroscopy. It was hella hard, if I'm allowed to say that. So like, it was a real hard course. I remember distinctly, getting the first exam back and being told what the average was for the exam, taking the exam and I wouldn't look at it, going into the restroom so that if I cried, nobody would see me. I didn't cry.
Oh,
I was slightly above the average. And, I wasn't like a straight A student in undergrad, but like I did okay. I think my last like 4 semesters, I was all A's or A minuses, maybe a B plus here or there, but like I did pretty well. And so like when I got to grad school, it wasn't going to be like that. And I didn't know how I would handle it, but I was like, okay, I'm okay being average. I just want to
hmm
survive, and it was really
hmm
hard, but I liked it. I really did like the challenge. I don't know that, yeah, I don't know that I knew what to expect exactly in terms of the difficulty level, but I appreciated it.
I love hearing, and not to say that you struggle, but whenever students maybe go from high school to college, from undergrad to grad, they have this expectation, but then sometimes they see professors, they see teachers, they see scientists, and they think, oh, they probably got all A's throughout college and in high school. But then you talk to scientists, and a lot of times they struggle and they didn't get A's on every test, and I can attest that was me too. So I really enjoy you being upfront and being open with that and just saying, hey, yeah, this class I really enjoyed, but it was very difficult too. So I think it's just really positive for students to hear that from a professor. So this kind of goes on a little bit. I always like showcasing or talking about mistakes, because I think mistakes are really opportunities for people to learn. And I have in here, we're going to talk maybe a little bit about what's a mistake that you made early on that maybe taught you something, or again, made you pivot a little bit.
So I actually gave this question a lot of thought. And it's funny because I hate to say this, but I could not come up with a mistake that had made me pivot. That I realized it is not because I'm infallible, and not that I don't make mistakes. It's just I honest to God would tell you that I think that I make mistakes very much on the daily, very, very much on the daily. And it is something where I would say every little thing that happens, there's kind of a couple aspects to those things, right? So like you make a mistake. I make a mistake in my teaching. I make a mistake in research, I make a mistake in teaching lab, I make a mistake in prepping lab, I make a mistake in whatever decisions at home I make, or what have you. But I think the first thing is kind of like recognizing that, oh, what I made or what I said or that decision I made was actually a mistake. May not have been the best thing or may not have worked out in the way that I wanted. Just kind of like recognizing that that happened is like first and foremost. Self-recognition is very hard sometimes.
Hmm.
But then, I think that I have gotten better as I've gotten a little older and wiser about saying like, what can I like do to just try not to do that again? Or to make that better the
Hmm.
next time around, or say, yep, that was a mistake. I will do this next time, like really actually learning from it and not just like sitting around beating myself up about it too much. The third thing I was gonna say is that I've gotten a lot, well, I wouldn't even say I'm like great at it, but I've gotten a lot better about just like letting myself make mistakes and owning it. And just being like, I gotta try and see if that was a mistake or not. Obviously, nothing that's gonna like harm anybody or put anybody's job at risk or something crazy like that. But like saying like, I'll try. And if it went poorly, then I can say like, but I tried that and it went poorly. And so I could do this better the next time. It's a super kind of generic response, but that was kind of the best I could come up with because there wasn't any like super major life mistakes that I could like remember, having had happen.
I think that's a great that's a perfect response, and I agree with you. I feel like as I've gotten older and maybe a little wiser, and maybe my prefrontal cortex has developed a little more, I can understand that those mistakes are not who I am, and they're just learning opportunities. Yeah, that's something that I struggled when I started teaching at the high school level. That's something I also struggled early on, but then I kind of shifted my way of looking at mistakes, and I was like, oh, these aren't who I am. I just need to learn from them. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah, and I think as a scientist, you could take it as like it's an experiment, right? So like you did something, you made a decision to try and do something, and if it didn't work, it's like then you take that, it's critical thinking. You move on and do it better next time, or try to,
Yeah,
because you might mess it up
I think
again.
it's. Did you ever take an unexpected turn in your career path? We talked a little bit about this. I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
dive into another story or another type of, just avenue.
Yeah, so definitely. So I think the I talked about the ones from undergrad that I had kind of decided, but I think probably what I was going to say is like if I were to write down like my resume on a sheet of paper and give it to a high school student who's thinking they might want to become a college professor or what have you, it's going to look like I knew what I was doing every step of the way, and I very much did not. I kind of made that next decision when the time came. Like I wasn't just completely floating or floundering, but it was kind of like, okay, this is now coming to an end. I know that there's a next step that needs to be taken. What are my options? Let's go with that and trying to make the best of those as I could, right? So college, then to graduate school, postdoc. I did a visiting professorship and then had my first tenure track position, and those all looked like they happened, like I knew what I was going to see, where I was going to be, 10, 20 years down the line. And that was not the case at all. It was just kind of like kind of going with the flow and also making the most of those decisions because, one, I alluded to just kind of like being happy where you are and making your happiness where you are, but also as a professional, right? The more constructive you can be in any position, the better it sets you up for the next position. So that's just this kind of like, the wisest kind of thing. I think the biggest pivot I've made has actually been the one I took in the past year, which was to decide to change institutions, teaching institutions. And this is the first time as I had to kind of sit down and think about how I would like say this or maybe write it, kind of like journaling would be the first time I've made a decision in my professional career that wasn't, okay, it's time for me to move on in my career. What do I do next? And instead it was, I am making a decision to leave this place to go to this place. Right. And so
Hmm.
that was big for me because it was all on me. It wasn't expected of me to do that. And I think that's hard, and to know everybody always says the dang grass is always greener on the other side. And it's just like, no, it doesn't even necessarily need to be greener. It might just be a different shade, slightly different
Yep.
shade. And that's okay too, So,
Yeah.
um, so I would say that was my biggest one. But I would again really want to focus like on that idea of where you are as you're making those decisions and going to different um, what do I want to say, like posts on your mark, posts on your trail through your career or what have you, is like, what can I make the most of here? How can I enjoy this the
Hmm.
most, right? I would say both in my professional and personal life is, I've had my partner with me and a lot of the decisions and places that we've been, I liked living in this house. I liked this about that place. I liked, oh, we had this pet when we were here, or what have you. And just kind of like, they're all highlights along the journey. So,
I love when you said, being happy with where you're at, but also, kind of looking forward. There's a quote that I tell my athletes. If any athletes are watching this, they'll know the quote. Be where your feet are, because a lot of times my athletes will, when we're jumping, they'll either have a bad jump, and they'll kind of be reflecting on that.
yeah.
And I'm like, no, no, no. Hey, like, you can reflect on it, but be where your feet are. Be happy. Like, let's look at the next jump. So I think it's,
Hmm.
I feel like there's so many congruent things that we talk about, not only just in our whatever, but I think we see things very similarly. Let's take
Yeah.
a step back, if you don't mind. So in grad school, or going from, I think we talked a little bit about your undergrad going into grad school.
Yeah.
Can we talk just a little bit further about, what our after grad school, what did that look like? Applying for different,
Mm.
you specifically got your PhD in, you
Chemistry.
said protein structure, chemistry, but
It
was
was,
it was
so
it
it was in
about
the,
protein structure?
it was in the, yeah. So actually that's a good point, because I didn't get to mention this earlier. Is so I was in the chemistry department at Pitt. So my degree is in chemistry. I think that I'd have to, I don't even have my degree where I'm at right now. I think it would say chemistry. But yeah, so I have a PhD in chemistry, but then the kind of what you choose to do your research on for then your thesis kind of helps like define what real kind of niche chemist you are in the systems that you study. So I identify as a biophysical chemist, and I joke that I just like to steal all of the sciences and combine them. Um, so breaking that down, love chemistry, love molecules. Physical chemists typically will apply kind of laws of physics or more mathematical principles to understanding of chemistry. So it's really kind of just a really more math heavy version of chemistry. So if you give me, an equation that explains how a molecule or a sample of molecules behaves, I'm really, really happy. Like, I like to look at that.
Mhm.
I like to see how that can predict, either pressure, volume, temperature, or maybe what energy states the molecules will be in, and things like that. So that's kind of, that's a branch of chemistry that you would study in undergrad. And then in grad school, I joined a group that would have been called a physical chemistry group, right? Because
Mhm.
they applied a lot of the theories that a physical chemist might study to investigating whatever samples they're studying. In that group, I was put on projects, or I joined and was interested in projects that were biological systems. So I worked on a protein DNA molecule for a while. I worked on a peptide for a little while, and then I've carried that through into my career. So that's where the kind of the bio end comes in. So, I have experience expressing cells to make proteins, purifying said proteins. And then I would say like my investigation end is more in like the physical chemistry realm. So that's where I get to steal like all three of the terms.
When I talk to PhD people with a doctorate, they always say, like, they try to explain as much as they can without going too far. What was your specific PhD in, if you can explain that? I know you were kind of talking a little bit about that, but could you like explain that just even a little more?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that I have a specific PhD in like any, okay. All right, so biophysical chemistry, I'd say, was like one aspect of it. And spectroscopy was the technique. So, biosystems, spectroscopy, and I learned how to do some computational simulation. So I learned a technique called molecular dynamic simulations, which is basically like if you've ever seen like those ball and stick models of a molecule, looks like that. And then the program kind of simulates where they predict the balls, which would be the atoms, are going to move based on what we know about the physics of a bond or a bond angle, or as you get into more complicated angles of a molecule. So it basically uses like basic physics laws of motion to predict how a large molecule is going to behave. So I learned how to do that a little bit. In
Hmm.
particular, the main kind of overarching theme for my research group that I was in grad school And then I've again carried through was the technique that we used. So I learned a technique called electron spin or paramagnetic resonance. And I usually tell people it's like doing MRIs on molecules. It literally is the same science. It's the same theory as MRI. It's just on, you know, teeny tiny individual groups of molecules, and where we're
Hmm.
looking at the electrons in those molecules, to give us some kind of signal to tell us either, you can use it to either learn about the local environment around a certain region in the molecule where this electron is, or you can put, labels on the system you're looking at. So let's say a protein at two different places where they have these two unpaired electrons. The electrons have to be unpaired. We don't need to go into why, but they have to be unpaired. We got the two electrons, and they'll actually talk to each other. And so I distinctly remember meeting with my PhD advisor. I don't know if it was when I think it was actually when I was visiting graduate school and or visiting Pitt to decide if I wanted to go there. And I don't think I actually had him lined up as a person that I wanted to meet. And they threw him on my schedule. And I was like, well, all right, And he was
Hmm.
telling me how he could use this instrumentation and his technique as a nanoscale ruler to measure like very small distances in a molecule. And I just remember thinking, like, that's pretty cool. Like that's, and it just sounded like something that as a person who didn't grow up in a family with a really strong history of scientific background. I was like, that makes sense to me. I understand exactly what you're saying, and I could apply that. And I thought proteins were cool, and so I kind of fell in love with that, and I still use that technique to this day.
Oh wow! Is that something? Is that a technique that has been around for a long time, or is that a relatively new type of research?
So I would say the technique itself has been around for some time, but it was used a lot for like really obscure. I want to say more like material sciences originally. So anything that would have like unpaired electrons kind of embedded in the materials. It's also can
Hmm.
be applied to metals. So any metals that have unpaired electrons. I worked on metals a little bit. Don't care for them. Rather stay with proteins. But the science of doing this. So we have to take our proteins and actually label them to introduce this. Again, it needs to be an unpaired electron. And most of the biomolecules in your body do not have unpaired electrons, thank God, because they're really reactive. And that's where, you get bad reactions happening in the body that could lead to things like cancers and other diseases. Um, but the technique that people started kind of really looking at applying this to proteins, I think back in the late 1980s, if I'm remembering my literature correctly, and a group out of University of California, don't ask me which branch, learned how to kind of like generate these labels and put them on proteins that would have a stable unpaired electron. So now you can put in the instrument and it'll work. Whereas the things that you use for like MRI, it relies, I think, on the water in your body, which is already there. It already gives like kind of like the signal. But with ESR, you have to actually introduce your unpaired electron.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I always love hearing about different fields of research that I've never heard of, and that is
Yeah.
awesome. Your time as a grad student, what are some maybe things that you enjoyed about that, and maybe what are some things that you found difficult with grad school? Maybe not specifically Pitt, but when you were at Pitt, just about grad school. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that grad school was like, it was a really great time in my life just because it was like, you're at for me anyway, and I would say I would say traditional students that are going there after undergrad, even if you take a year or two off, just kind of like that age and being on your own and independent. That was just kind of cool. And then getting to really be in the lab doing research for the first time was both daunting, but also really fun to get to kind of see that as like a day in and day out kind of activity that I got to do. The other thing that I learned is, I think when I distinctly remember having a conversation with a friend my senior year of college, thinking I was still on that path of maybe forensics. And we discussed that a little bit more. And when I kind of learned more about what that would mean, I was like, maybe that's not it. I don't know what I'm going to do. I guess I'll go to grad school. Dr. Sarver sounds cool. I literally said those words. And yeah, maybe not the best reason to make that decision, but it didn't hurt anything. So, for those who might be watching this and thinking about what does that post college career look like, for a lot of people in the sciences, graduate school is completely free. right? It doesn't put you in any further debt. You get paid a stipend, and it's not huge, but it's enough to live off of. And so it was one of those decisions where it's like, I guess I apply, I pay some money to do the applications, and then it didn't hurt me at all, or it wouldn't hurt me at all if I decided a year or two in, yeah, this isn't for me. I'm going to try and go into, industry or something like that. So it was a pretty easy decision to make once I was able to kind of, and I was fortunate that I was able to get into the schools that I wanted to and applied to. Um, but the other thing I think I was going to say is that getting to graduate school, part of why it doesn't cost you anything, and how they help, pay for your tuition and keep you living, is because a lot of times you will get paid as a teaching assistant. So as a full-time TA, right? So you'll teach the labs, or you'll teach a recitation section, which is like kind of a lecture review where you might, review homework problems or whatnot. As a graduate student, a lot of big schools rely on graduate students to do that because they simply just can't fill that with the staff that they have, and it's a good way to keep students employed and let them keep doing their research. And so I thought teaching might be something that I'd be interested in, but that's when I got to really, like, I TA'd a lab in undergrad. And I remember doing it. I don't remember being scared. I don't know that I gave it much thought when it happened. It was like a way to make some money. But then when I got to grad school, I was regularly having to TA in my first year. And then a couple years after that, it just kind of depends on the funding that your research advisor has. And so kind of on and off, I would do it. And the years that I was TAing, while it was stressful because you would be expected to still produce in the lab, but you'd have to go and teach for 3 hours that day or something like that. I remember distinctly thinking, like, when I got to go and hang out with the undergrads, it was a really great reprieve. You know what I mean? And I was nobody necessarily loves grading, but like, I didn't mind that. I didn't mind the prep. I loved being with and interacting with the students in the lab, which is mostly what I was doing. And so that's what really kind of fostered my interest for teaching, that I don't know, that it may have been underlying, but it was not my initial intent when going to grad school.
Going from being obviously you're still doing research, but as you went from, after you graduated with your PhD, going to a university, what did that kind of look like? That outlook of, hey, I'm graduating now, I got to figure out what I'm doing postdoctorally, if that's a word, I'm not sure if it is. What did that look like?
So yeah, actually, that's a great follow-up question, because I would say, when I was in grad school, so again, it was like, I want to teach. But there are two major veins of teaching in higher education, right? Which is what we would say like PUIs. There's a variety of terms you could use, but PUIs, primarily undergraduate institutions, which are a lot more teaching focused. And you might do research, like I do research, but like my numero uno, like the major percentage of my day to day is supposed to be and is focusing on teaching, working on my teaching, and working with students on their coursework, right? And then a small portion is the research, versus there's a different variety of ways that people would term them, but I'll just call them research institutions, which are your University of Pittsburgh, your Penn State University, your University of Pennsylvania, is like your bigger schools. The professors at those schools will teach a much smaller fraction of courses, maybe one a year, and then they will spend the rest of their time managing their research labs, writing grants, thinking the big ideas. There's pros and cons to each of them. It's just a matter of like what flavor you like, right? My PhD advisor kept trying to push me to go into a research institution, and I was like, no, it's just, I don't like research that much. Like I can do it here, and I've learned a lot, but it was actually quite a struggle for me, I would say. And one of the things I think you had asked too about grad school was like, what were the pluses, what were the minuses? The minuses were, there was a lot of times, especially as a first generation, I was a first generation undergrad, but definitely a first generation PhD candidate, and like, I remember when I was applying to grad school, my parents were like, we don't even know how to help you. Like, we don't know I don't think they fully even grasped what it was I was doing. And I don't know that I knew what I was doing, and so I thought research was really hard. There were good challenges, but then there were other bad challenges where I was just like, I just don't even know what I don't know and how to get forward with this. And so there was a bit of a push, I think more so out of more of just kind of like pride. Like a research professor wants to see their research children go on and do great things like they have done. And I was like, that's good for you, not for me. That's not for me. That's not where I want to be. But I wasn't 100% sure. So then I decided the best option for me would be to do a postdoctoral research assistantship. And so I also, want to say too, like, I think this is a point to be made. This might have been something I was thinking of a little bit earlier, was going back to kind of like the being happy where you are, but also remembering like you got a long life out ahead of you, and that was nothing that I particularly feared. I wasn't necessarily like ready to settle into like any one location, right? And so I was happy to say, okay, I'll do a postdoc. So typically, just to provide some, like a background, a postdoc would require either you to procure your own funding, maybe through some kind of national institute with some kind of project idea you have, what lab you want to do that in, or you would find, a professor at a particular school that you're interested in. And if they have the funds, because typically a postdoc will make a little bit more money, they'll hire you and be able to pay you to do that job. You don't have to go through any you don't have to take any further classes or anything like that. There's no GPAs associated with it like there is in grad school, nothing like that. Yeah, it's very much just a job. It's pretty much a job. It's a low paying job. But the goal is is that you will either learn maybe a new technique, you'll advance the technique you already know, you'll get more publications. So that's another thing in academia. Credentials are oftentimes gauged by like how much you've published. It depends what avenues you're going. Research institutions, that's 100% true, right? Not it kind of gets a little bit less as you get to more teaching focused schools. But so, I had a few publications from grad school, but I thought I could get more as a postdoc. But I also more so was like, I'm not sure. I don't think I want to do a research university, but I keep getting pushed to try that. And it was kind of like, well, that seems like a pretty big deal. Could I do that? Or do I think I want to teach? Maybe I'll try somewhere else. And I wanted to kind of, just go somewhere that wasn't with my current advisor, see how that worked out, see what my gut instinct was. And also I got to pick up a new technique, as I said. So that was something I thought was, I picked a particular professor, and fortunately I did not get my own funding because that's actually quite hard to do, but like he had funding. I met him at a conference. I was pretty straightforward and said, I'm looking to graduate from grad school soon. If you have any openings in your lab, could I come and visit? It was really awkward to ask somebody those questions, but had to be done to find like kind of that next spot. And I knew that that was a location I was interested in, and he had the kind of credentials that would be good for me, and was doing the techniques that I already knew, but I could learn new techniques in his lab that I was trying to I guess I did give a little bit of forethought for this one, was that I knew that if I learned, it was particularly the kind of protein work, like the protein expression stuff. I didn't know how to do that so well in grad school. But I knew if I went and learned how to do that as a postdoc, that was something I could potentially do with undergrads. So if I decide research institution, I'll already have all the chops. They will give me a ton of money to do whatever I want to do. But if I decide to go undergrad institution, I need to have a technique that I can use, or something I can do in the lab that undergrads can do and that I can afford to do with less money at a teaching institution, because they don't give you the same amount of funds that you would get at a research institution.
One of the things I'm just interject is the importance of this. I don't want to say it's a soft skill, but the communication and just being able to talk with professors, like you were saying. There's so many times where I'm talking to these individuals, either in grad school or in a postdoc situation, where it's important that you learn how to, at a conference, kind of network a little bit and just work with other people. And I just love hearing that, because I think students need to hear that. It's not just, hey, because we're all tech based now, we're all doing things by ourselves. You still need to have that soft skill of being able to interact and just build those relationships with those professors.
Yeah, definitely. Networking, and scientists are notoriously, I'm going to put us out there, weird and socially awkward. I don't suffer from that gene like quite as much as some folks, but like it definitely is still awkward to do, but you got to get over it. And I have made, I don't burn bridges, and I try and make as many connections, and I will reach out to people that I maybe haven't talked to in a long time and just be like, remember we met? Blah, 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 blah. Because you just never know ever where, like, look at this, Chris, right? Like, well, we're related, so this is a little biased, but if you really disliked me from the times we met, you wouldn't have asked me to do an interview. But like, you
Yep.
never know what you're going to get out of any interaction you have with people and where you might need to kind of look back and rekindle that interaction again for something, or even
Mm.
just like for fun, to reach out to somebody because they live somewhere or whatever, so.
What's the coolest or weirdest thing that you've discovered in your research? And I'm hoping this is going to be a great story.
Okay, so don't set me up too high here. Like, so uh when I will say, like, this is the coolest thing that I've got to do in my research, I would say. Well, I have another like cool story of something that somebody did research wise, but I might say that at the end. Um when I so I did my postdoc and we were doing this. I was still doing this technique, this ESR technique. And that's primarily used for like protein systems. So that's what I decided I was going to do. I did a visiting professorship, did some research there, carried that through to my first tenure track position, and was still focusing on the same protein. And that was fine, but it was really hard to really move that project forward. And I had been teaching a food chemistry course at it was at Westminster College. And so I covered the gamut in the food chemistry course of all these different things. And I had students like approaching me about doing research. And I had visited a lab up in Boston, Bruker Industries. So they make a lot of the instrumentation that these they primarily are the main company that make these ESR spectrometers. And interestingly, there I met one's just funny. The other one actually has impacted my career. But one guy, I walked in, I remember them giving me a tour and they walked me into this room and they had this little machine on the table. And the guy's like, I'm doing research on beer. And I was like, I love beer. This is great. And he's like, yeah, so you can like do all these measurements about these different types. I don't remember the details he told me at the time. It was not at all like I was in grad school, I think, at the time. And so I was like, that's pretty cool. Another guy actually was doing research on like whole organisms to see what they could detect. So he wouldn't let us
Mm.
kill any of the 1,000 leggers that were running around the building because he was saving them and letting them die and collecting them and putting them into the instrument. And I was like, this is
Oh
gross,
my.
It was so gross. But anywho, so fast forward, this guy was doing the beer chemistry. And so like I had students wanting to do research with me, and I'd started kind of getting into the food chem stuff and talking a little bit about preservation of food and fermentation. And I was like, well, you could do ESR on beer. I know a guy that was doing that up at Bruker in Boston. And so like I'll look into that a little bit more. And so I found like a book chapter on doing ESR on food and beverages and things like that. So I kind of started a project working with beer, and that's been still ongoing and stuff that I have ideas for going forward. And that's been really fun because, even if you're not a beer drinker, as a beverage, it's varied in the different styles that were made and how people make it, and the big brewers and the small brewers, independent breweries and things like that. So I have a lot of students that have gotten interested in that and kind of manipulated from that. I don't remember. I think it was just like a random article I had with a student that needed to present on something research related. We picked this article on people looking at kombucha, which for those people that don't know, kombucha is a fermented tea beverage. So sweetened tea, and then you allow it just to get a little funky, and then it ferments. And the way that it works is it relies on, so fermentation is the basically, eating of sugar by microorganisms, and you just hope you outweigh the bad bacteria with the good bacteria, and they usually make things kind of taste sour and have a different flavor to them, and that's how kombucha works. But kombucha also relies on this thing called a SCOBY. So the SCOBY stands for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, and they undergo the fermentation, but they call the SCOBY also this like cellulose layer that builds on the top of kombucha. Have you ever seen this? Have you ever Googled
No.
kombucha? It looks like a booger. It's like a giant booger that floats on the top of the beverage. You're going to Google it right now.
Yeah, sorry. Is it cellulose, you said? Cellulose?
It's a cellulose layer. You can just Google SCOBY, SCOBY.
Hold on, sorry.
COBY.
Spell it again. SCOBY?
COBY.
Oh, like something like this?
Yeah. It's not very pretty.
Oh my.
Yeah. But it's mostly cellulose. It feels like very gelatin. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason why that happens is that the bacteria, well, the benefit of that is the bacteria grow that, and the cellulose layer actually acts as a protective layer to keep kind of any bad bacteria out from the air from getting into the beverage. And then the bacteria and yeast that are in the beverage you can consume, and they're supposed to be good for you as a probiotic. So that's the history of
Huh.
kombucha. All right. So I had, started kind of doing kombucha stuff. My students and I were buying SCOBY from Amazon. We're kind of growing our own. And I had this student that was like, she found this article where people were using the byproducts of fermented beverages, like the antioxidants that come from them. And that's what I was interested in measuring as a marker for like health products, for like skincare. So she's like, my grandfather has a really big garden, grows all these different fruits and vegetables. What if I gather a bunch of his leaves from his garden and we use those as our like organic material, like our tea, and we make kombucha out of all these different leaves? And so I started a project that went on for a couple years with the same batch of leaves. We dried them so that we could preserve them and use them over and over again, because in science you got to retest things so many times. And I think one of the coolest things we've done is that we made tea. So we'd start with a regular batch of kombucha. It's like black tea, like literally Lipton tea bags. You sugar that, you buy the SCOBY from Amazon, throw it in there, let that ferment for a couple weeks. And then we would take the liquid out of that and move it into beakers with grape leaves, berry leaves, apple leaves, lemon leaves. We had like all kinds of leaves from different fruit trees and bushes. And then we made our own tea and just put the liquid in. And then after a couple weeks, you'd start seeing like this little fuzzy layer. Like, it wasn't fuzzy, that's not right. It's like a slimy boogery layer growing on top, and you could tell that your tea was actually fermenting, and the kombucha was working because you were starting to get that little cellulose layer. And there's nothing cuter than going into the lab and seeing this little lineup of like 7 teas with their little cellulose layers growing on it. And I just thought that was the coolest highlight for me, because it was like something you could easily do in your kitchen, but we were getting to do in the lab and investigate it using some really cool instrumentation in the laboratory. So
That is that is awesome. I love having students hear that if you're interested in something, there is a scientist out there that's willing to work with you and willing to research that a little
it's
bit more.
true.
That is really
Yeah.
interesting. We talked about advice that we give students, either looking into going into a science field or looking into going into a science like undergrad or grad program. What's another maybe odd piece of advice that you would give a high school or undergrad or grad student about just their journey through science? Is there something else that we haven't maybe talked about today that you wish you would have learned when you were in those positions?
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest things, I think kind of, it's kind of like two things, but I think they go hand in hand, is just to kind of like be open-minded and kind of be ready for like, your next opportunity. You may not even recognize it as an opportunity. So being open to things would be, in higher ed, we often joke that students go into undergrad with the intention of going into three professions. That would be to be a teacher, a lawyer, or a doctor, right? And that's because that's what we know. Like, those are professions that we know. You see on television a lot. People, you go to the doctor, you see all your teachers. And I'm allowed to make fun of this because I'm a teacher, right? But like, there is so many different opportunities in the sciences out there beyond academia, but even like within academia. Like I mentioned, there's your research science universities, right, where you're going to be primarily focused on writing grants and doing your research. And then there's the more teaching oriented colleges. There are people that work at universities that aren't teaching at all, and they're just research scientists. If you work in industry, you can have a bachelor's and be working at the lab bench all the time and loving that. You could have a master's and make your way up a little bit into a managerial position, or you could have a PhD and make it way up where you never see a lab bench. Maybe for the better. Who knows, what it is that you want. And there's people that work in government. So I think, I'm sure that there are jobs out there that I don't know of. And I'm not talking, generally science. I'm even just saying like as a chemist, right? Or as a biochemist going and getting that degree. I know that I worked with a student when I was at Westminster that had no interest in working in a lab bench. And so she did some computational work with me because she was like, I don't want to get my hands dirty in the lab. I like chemistry. I don't want to do it in the lab. She currently works for a company where she works from home, and she helps them with their web design and just making sure, I think, like the descriptions are accurate, and she knows the science, but she doesn't have to do any of that lab work. And so there's a really wide array of job opportunities. So be aware of that and kind of be open to that idea. And then secondly would be just being available for those opportunities. Like, if something is, you don't know whether you should volunteer or you should go to that networking event or you should present something somewhere, somebody gives you an opportunity to do something, take advantage of any opportunity you can, because you never know where you'll make a connection or learn about something that you didn't know existed or didn't know how it worked. That could be kind of like your next step, your next career move, or really influence your trajectory down the line.
That's a wonderful, wonderful place that I think we're going to end on, because again,
Awesome.
I couldn't say it better myself. So thank you so much.
Awesome.
But I know you as Jess, but Jess, thank you so much for speaking with us today, for talking. And I hope any student that's looking into going into a chemistry field, being a professor or just going into higher education, can definitely take something. And we have to have a second round if you're okay with it. I know your schedule is going to get busy here in the next week with or classes start Monday.
Tuesday, because it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday. But yeah, I got an 8 a.m. lab on Tuesday. Got to go in and talk to them about safety and Lewis structures, and they're going to love me.
Well, thank you so much. We'll have to schedule maybe in the next couple of days if you have more time. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time, because I know this took you a lot of time, and you're a busy person. So thank you so much for speaking with us today.
No, it was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for asking me. I enjoyed it.